Welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast, where we explore sustainable placemaking, climate action in cities, and urban rewilding. I'm your host, Bosco Verticale, an urban designer, educator, and sustainable placemaking consultant. We've all seen them, two residential towers cloaked in vibrant vegetation and trees. Surrounded otherwise by concrete and glass, they make a statement that says this could be the future. The Bosco Verticale, or vertical forest, buildings in Milan have become emblematic of the city's regeneration, and for some people, sustainable architecture in general. They are undeniably beautiful, and they seem unquestioningly sustainable. We'll get to that. So why aren't there vertical forest buildings everywhere? Why not just make every new building along these lines? Wouldn't cities be much better places if we did? In this article, I explain why the vertical forest hasn't become a standard building approach and look a little bit deeper at its sustainability credentials. Now, hopefully at this point you know exactly the type of buildings I am talking about. So Bosco Verticale in Milan, Italy, as you'll see on the cover photo of this episode, is world famous. You've seen these photos all over the internet. People use them as a kind of stand-in image for sustainable architecture or for biophilic cities or for biodiversity in an urban context. And I hear people pretty frequently talking about these buildings as being, the future, as being something that we need to aspire towards, something that should be commonplace and should be normal. And it seems like, why would you question that would be a good thing to do? Clearly that would be a good thing. And of course we've seen CGIs and AI generated images of familiar city streets covered in green roofs and all sorts of vegetation on buildings. And people look to this and say, this could be the future. We could work towards this as a green future. And I think that's wonderful that people are, have those more utopian visions for the future as opposed to things just being grey and glass and concrete and sterile. I really do. However, let's look under the surface and think a little bit more deeply about whether these buildings actually are sustainable, what good they are delivering, and also think about why is it that they are still such an uncommon sight in cities around the world, despite the fact that this is a very popular visual, and you'll see a lot of CGIs of buildings proposing something similar to these kind of originators in Milan. But built-out projects are still kind of few and far between. So a little bit of history on these particular buildings, the Bosco Verticale. They were designed by Stefano Boeri architects, who are based in Milan as well. It's become their signature style. The project was commissioned around 2007 as part of a wider regeneration area called Porta Nuova in Milan, former industrial area that is now a really, really nice, regeneration area with a number of tall buildings, very, very good public realm and landscaping around it. And these buildings, the vertical forest, very, very iconic for that area and for Milan in general. Now, just to say, Stefano Boeri architects, lots of respect for the vision and the skill and the design that went into delivering this. And obviously that's become their kind of calling card. They have designed and delivered a few more of similar types of buildings, vertical forest buildings, in other cities around the world. Totally respect them for that. I will be kind of critical in a way about this building going forward. Whenever I'm being critical of anything on this podcast, it's never meant to be a personal attack on everyone. I know designers, architects, planners, they're all out there trying to do good work and trying to do their best for the most part. But this is, this podcast is really about looking under the surface, thinking in a more systemic way, and, really thinking through past, I suppose, what the typical discourse is around these kind of things. It can be easy to fall into the narrative that just because something looks amazing and beautiful and green, that it must be sustainable and we should be replicating it. Okay, I have three main reasons why the vertical forest as a building typology has not become mainstream or everyday, despite this being kind of part of the narrative. From not only Stefano Boeri architects, but other architects as well, other developers and people who who operate in these spaces. So, reason one, it's a landmark building, not everyday urbanism. So, most cities are made up of kind of standard building typologies that get replicated. And we've seen this all throughout history. So, terraced housing, courtyard blocks, suburban semi-detached homes, different geographies and different eras have their sort of standard building typologies that makes it somewhat straightforward to build out large areas of city in a fairly quick time without having to sort of individually design every single building or reinvent the wheel with every single building. Now, peppered throughout that in cities around the world, there will always be landmark buildings. So these are the castles, the cathedrals, the mosques, the town halls. Obviously, Bosco Verticale is a landmark building, and it kind of has to be. So the first thing to say is that Bosco Verticale is not a normal residential development. It's a luxury residential development. So a quick check online shows that an 82 square meter, one bedroom apartment in this building is on sale for 1.3 million euro. A 4-bed family unit will set you back 5.5 million euros. So this is not normal. It's not a normal type of building that would house, normal people, basically. This is luxury. It's wealthy people. It's investment properties, whatever. This is not a replicable model for addressing the housing crisis, or indeed even for just housing everyday citizens in lush, biophilic, sustainable surroundings. So that's the first thing. Now you might say, well, does it have to be? Maybe that's just because this was a redevelopment and the developer wanted to get a big return. Like, does it need to be luxury housing? And to be honest, I think at this stage it kind of does need to be a luxury development because it's so expensive to design and maintain. So here I'll get into some of the figures that I've gotten from the Stefano Boeri Architects website about the different aspects of the building. So there's 800 trees and 20,000 plants, reportedly, that are on the facade and on the balconies of this building. Now, who looks after those? How are they maintained? How did they stay looking so good? This building was delivered in 2014. It still looks amazing. It's maintained regularly. And how they do this is that there's a building manager, and all the plants are in common ownership, and they're looked after by the building management company. So individual residents don't have any decision-making power or maintenance of, the trees that are on there outside of their window, basically. And so the way they do this is they have these specialist, what they call flying gardeners, who are these, trained gardeners who abseil down from the roof to maintain the greenery and keep everything safe and looking good. You can imagine that means one hell of an annual maintenance fee for the apartment owners. So people pay a lot to buy the apartment there, and they pay a lot every year to keep it looking as it is, keep it very well maintained. Very, very difficult to deliver that in an affordable package for normal people. I keep saying normal people as if wealthy people aren't real people, but you know what I mean. Like the average citizen, the 99% of people who will not afford a property in a luxury development like this. I suppose this kind of expense is maybe hinted at in that some later iterations of the concept. For instance, the architects have delivered another vertical forest building in Tirana, is much less ambitious with the level of greening. So if you put the two side by side, there's just far fewer trees on this example in Tirana, which came after the original Bosco Verticale in Milan. So I guess that is a way of basically bringing down the cost, is you just make it much less ambitious. In which case, we're kind of talking about a different thing. But so that's my first point, is that it's very expensive. It's a landmark building. There will be a few of them around the world, but it's very difficult to deliver this as like a standard typology that everyone could afford to live in and to benefit from. Reason two is that architects don't like to copy each other, at least not so obviously. So I've spoken about how the Bosco Verticale is Stefano Boeri Architects' signature style, and the fact is, and even though it definitely has inspired a lot of other architects to deliver the sort of trees on buildings aesthetic that we now see popping up around the world, from like London to China and everywhere in between. really to take, this concept down to the details, and for another architect to take that and deliver it somewhere else, it would be just kind of a crazy thing to do. Like, architects don't do that. There might even be lawsuits involved. I don't know how it works with intellectual copyright, but it would just be a crazy thing to do, to think that this could become a standard typology, that all of the learnings, all of the R&D that went into this original building could just be, taken by other architects. Which is why when you see other architects and developers doing their version of a sort of building with trees on it, it always looks quite different to this original version. So that is something that's really important to bear in mind, is that, this is a very specific landmark building, special building typology. A lot of R&D went into it. It's very well thought out. There's a lot of technical knowledge, technical aspects to delivering something like this. A lot of that will still be resting with the original team that can then replicate it and build on it in other projects. But it's not like, your average Joe architect in the next city over can just say, oh, that's a good idea, I'll do that in my next project. It's a bit more complicated than that. And it's this aspect of intellectual property, and not to be seen as just copycatting other architects, I think is a very big part of culture. So those are my first two, relatively short, straightforward reasons. It is very expensive landmark building, so quite a special building. And it's something that's very attached to a particular architecture studio. So it's just not going to become, on those grounds alone, it's just not going to become like a really generic standard building approach that I think a lot of, casual observers would like to see, because they love how beautiful it is, and they feel like it must be good in sustainability terms. But that brings us on to the longer discussion here, which is reason 3, which is that, at least looking at this original building in Milan, Bosco Verticale, it's not actually that sustainable. Look, that might change going forward as building technology and approaches change, but there are some sort of built-in fundamental challenges to this kind of building typology. So let me explain. So, those of you listening to this podcast, I'm sure will understand that sustainability is not just about having plants all over your project. Sustainability, sustainable design, or regenerative design, which is also a term that's sometimes attached to this building, is very much about hard numbers, and a lot of it is about engineering and carbon accounting, as much as about grand, beautiful architecture. And so, let's look under the skin here. Let's tackle carbon emissions first, as kind of a fundamental part of environmental sustainability. And then I want to look at ecology and biodiversity benefits. Let's look at carbon emissions. As I mentioned earlier, the building was commissioned in 2007. So we're talking about a building that was designed, over 15 years ago. So in a way, it's not fair to compare that to our kind of cutting edge understanding of low carbon design now. So now, what the sort of, thought leaders in the industry are talking about is net zero carbon buildings, and building with timber, and using natural materials and lightweight structures, and all these things that, all these approaches that we can take to achieve extremely low carbon emissions, or even zero or negative carbon emissions in a building project. But this is 15 years ago that they're starting this design process. So obviously it's not a net zero carbon building. It's not regenerative in a carbon sense. And in fact, there is evidence that points towards it's probably a much higher embodied carbon building compared to like a standard building approach. So let me explain. For those of you who don't know embodied carbon, that is just a term that means the carbon emissions or the greenhouse gas emissions that are embodied in the construction of the building. So whatever emissions that occurred when the materials were being created or excavated or mined, and also in the construction and the general maintenance of the building over its lifespan. So there's a lot of aspects that go into embodied carbon. One of the main things is the materials that are used and the kind of structural design that is used. And this building kind of loses on both counts because it's made of reinforced concrete, which is steel covered in concrete, very carbon intensive compared to other materials like timber. But also, come back to the trees, guys. There's 800 trees on this, thousands of plants. That means also lots of soil. That's many, many tons of extra weight that are on the building structure that a conventional building wouldn't have. And so what does that mean for the structure? It means that that reinforced concrete needs to be much thicker, much heavier, and a lot more material is used in order to support all this vegetation and soil. And that means a lot more embodied carbon. Now, I looked around online. I wasn't able to find exact embodied carbon figures reported anywhere. To be fair, 2007, 2010 era, it wasn't, necessarily talked about quite so much as it is now, and probably less transparency around it. But there does seem to be a consensus that a building like this would have a lot more embodied carbon. So there's an article from the World Green Building Council, which generally talks about the building in, very positive light. But they also say in the article that this building has issues, challenges with its embodied carbon. So I'll link to that just so you can see that as a reference. But interestingly, Dark Matter Labs, who honestly, I wanted to go on the podcast for years. I've never kind of gotten around to properly making that happen. Maybe this is the year to do it. Dark Matter Labs, if you don't know, do incredible work. I won't even try to explain it here because a lot of it is very complicated, related to the real transition towards regenerative design and true sustainability, and really a lot of systems change work. But they have a Substack, and I follow them on Substack, and they did a nice article about regenerative design while I was writing my article about this, preparing this podcast. And they used Bosco Verticale as an example of greenwashing. And what they said is, quick calculation is that looking at the plans, the building structure is twice as thick in terms of the reinforced concrete that's used compared to a conventional building, and therefore has something like twice the embodied carbon as you would expect from a conventional building. So at this point, there can really be no argument that it is a sustainable building. I mean, it's literally twice as polluting in construction, in embodied carbon, compared to a conventional building, which, conventional buildings are not actually particularly sustainable either. So things are looking very bad from this point of view. On the architect's website, again, I'll put a link in the episode description to everything I'm referencing here, just so you can have a look yourself. They mentioned that the building, the greenery on the building, the vegetation absorbs 30 tons of carbon a year. I mean, that sounds pretty impressive considering most buildings don't sequester any carbon per year. That sounds good. Sounds like a good thing. But, we're talking about a building whose embodied carbon is probably going into the thousands of tons. And so 30 tons a year is basically nothing. So at least looking at the carbon greenhouse gas emissions aspect of sustainability, which is only one part of sustainability, sticking trees on buildings is not an efficient way of reducing carbon emissions. We need to be getting to net zero carbon, even into carbon negative buildings. This is kind of making that challenge more difficult because we're just adding more and more weight that doesn't need to be there on the building. I will say that the architect has done some concepts of timber frame versions of this building. So I think there was a project in Paris. I don't think it's been built for whatever reason, which was Bosco Verticale, but with timber as a structural element. Presumably that would be it definitely would be much less embodied carbon. So interesting to see if they can make that happen in the coming years. And that might help to address some of these concerns. Although there is an inherent irony in cutting down trees in a forest to make really beefy structural frame, so that then you can put small trees on the frame. In a city, it kind of feels like maybe just use less timber in the construction, and you'd save more. You'd save more trees in that way. I don't know. It's a kind of a strange argument, and I see why people do just kind of dismiss it once you really start thinking this through. On a positive note, the design may have some energy savings in use. So the building's greenery quoting directly here from the architect's website, says the building's vegetation regulate microclimate conditions, reducing humidity levels and lowering surface temperatures. I think that's the facade surface, by up to 30 degrees. This significantly reduces the energy requirement for indoor air conditioning, bringing down indoor temperatures by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. That's the end of the quote. So look, it's well understood that overheating can be a problem in buildings, particularly taller buildings, which can't benefit from street trees above, the first or second floor. And so, there's an interesting argument here about getting that greenery stacked up in front of every single apartment window so that you're getting the benefits of shading. But again, what's the trade-off with the embodied carbon? If you're doubling the embodied carbon in the building just so you can get some energy efficiency savings, I'm doubtful that really makes sense in a full carbon accounting perspective. Let's talk ecology. So this is probably what people instantly think of when they look at one of these buildings, Bosco Verticale, or another building with this much vegetation and greenery, is they think this must be really good for biodiversity. So they really, something I have to say that's really impressive about Bosco Verticale is how well thought through the vegetation is on it. So according to the architect's website, the vegetation study for the planting plan took 2 years to complete. So they put a lot of work into this, and the species that are planted change depending on which side of the building you're on. So the south side get more sun and warmth loving plants. The north side has plants that will thrive in a bit more shady, cooler conditions. So they've really thought through all these aspects, and it really shows when you go there in real life and you stand under it and you look at it on a beautiful summer's day or in the spring. It is blooming and vibrant and absolutely beautiful, and it stood the test of time because it's 11 years old now since it's finished construction, and it still looks great. However, appearances can be deceiving. Is it actually any good for wildlife? A study in 2018 that was published in the Journal of Urban Ecology looked at conducting bird surveys at 3 vegetated buildings in Milan. One of them was Bosco Verticale, and the other 2, I believe, had green walls. And they compared them to the general bird, the presence and the diversity of birds in the surrounding areas around those buildings, and to nearby conventional tall buildings. So you have some control in there so we can compare the benefits. Now, the good news is the vegetated buildings did attract a higher number and species diversity of birds who would land on them compared to the conventional buildings. However, the number of species seen landing on the vegetated buildings was lower than those found in the surrounding areas. So basically, the message is that birds, this is only looking at birds, not anything else, birds will use vertical forest buildings to perch if they're there, and presumably to do some foraging if there's anything growing there they can use. But I don't think there's any fruit trees, because then you have to deal with fruit falling 10 stories onto the pavement below. So I presume there's no fruit trees. So birds will make use of them, but alone they're not enough to make a meaningful difference in urban bird populations. The researchers say, quote, "This is likely due to there being an insufficient quantity of greenery on the building to provide core bird habitat, limiting their role to stepping stones within the wider vegetation network." And so this gets to the heart of issues with green buildings that claim to be mimicking natural habitats, or, we're replacing a forest with a vertical forest. But a vertical forest, as in a building covered in trees, is not the same thing as a real forest. In ecological terms, I use the metaphor of one of those annoying deconstructed desserts that you get at particular restaurants, where it's like, instead of a tiramisu, you just get all the ingredients of a tiramisu separately on your plate. Like, yeah, the ingredients are there, but they're not adding up to form the whole. The things need to be in relationship with each other to actually do that. And perhaps this is actually, these vegetated buildings are actually worse, because we think about what a forest actually is, or any ecosystem. It's a complex web of interactions. It's not just the vegetation that is there. It is the soil, the plants, the mycelium and the other fungal networks, it's the bacteria, it's the invertebrates, as well as all the animals that you see above the surface. It's also flows of nutrients. It's the way that water moves through the landscape. There's so many aspects that make an ecosystem function as a good habitat, as a functioning, healthy habitat for various animals. And so simply taking the trees and putting them in pots and then putting them all isolated near to each other on a building facade does not a forest make. We're really talking about we've just deconstructed a living system and put some of the elements together in a different way and called it a vertical forest. But it's not a forest at all. It's just a bunch of trees on a building. And you can see that reflected in the biodiversity, which is that it maybe has a bit, but it's not going to do much. And this makes sense when you really start to think about it. You really start to think through what are the habitat requirements for various species. And so, many bird species, in order to nest, will need semi-mature or mature trees. You're never going to find them on a vertical forest building because they're just too big and too heavy. And so, we're looking at sort of young-ish trees that will be on these kind of buildings because they're the ones that will sort of fit the size requirements and the weight requirements for this kind of use. You need, older buildings that have hollows in them for certain birds to nest, like owls. You would need, as I sort of alluded to earlier, you'd need, foraging. You need some food for them. You need to have some fruit and some nuts and that kind of thing. And I think those kind of trees and plants will not be selected generally for vertical forest buildings because then you have to deal with stuff falling off potentially several floors onto pavement below where people might be coming and going. So there's a lot of constraints that go into creating a vertical forest building like this. That means it just simply will not provide a lot of the essential elements that many animals will need, birds in this example, but also invertebrate species. Obviously, you need to have wings to get up to the upper floors. So that limits what invertebrates could usefully use it. But also, a lot of invertebrates have, quite complex life cycles. So they'll need, some water to lay their eggs in. They'll need then some more dense vegetation for another part of their life cycle, etc. And they find those in natural habitats. And they may even find them in urban parks if they're managed in a biodiverse way. But they probably won't find them on the sheer elevation of a building, even if it does have trees on the balconies. So, what do we do instead? Now, at this point, you might think that I hate I hate these buildings and I just hate Bosco Verticale. But actually, I don't. I'm genuinely happy that they exist as kind of landmark buildings, one-off, beautiful objects. And I don't see really any harm in giving people this sort of biophilic, nature-centered architecture where people say, actually, a bunch of trees is way more beautiful than any building could ever be. Sorry, architects. But, we all have this biophilic impulse within us that we just absolutely love and adore being around vegetation like this, which is why this has become such a landmark and so famous around the world. So I don't think these buildings shouldn't exist, but I think the problem is there hasn't been much critical thinking around what these buildings actually mean. Are they actually a response to the climate crisis? Do they actually support biodiversity in a meaningful way? And because people sometimes get lulled in by the flashy aesthetics, by the sort of grand gesture, people sort of think, oh yeah, that's the future, that's what we should be doing. And then they're not focusing on the actually much less flashy, much less spectacular things that we should be doing to actually make cities in general more sustainable, regenerative, biodiverse, healthier for people, more joyous to live in. So part of this is the fact that basically if you ask an architect what is the answer to a problem, they'll design you a building because that's their job. I'm not trying to be critical. It is literally their job to design buildings. And so, but the climate and biodiversity crisis in cities is very much an interdisciplinary topic. So any meaningful response to these challenges, it won't be about designing a really good building. It'll be the intersection of many disciplines. It'll be urban planning, ecology, engineering, architecture, yes, but also sociology, psychology, behavior change, systems thinking. All these things have to come together, and yeah, we'll have to design new buildings here and there, but we also need to rethink the existing parts of our cities. We need to retrofit existing buildings. We have to think about how we're using our streets and our parks. All of these things, in my mind, much more important for tackling the biodiversity and the climate crises than just putting trees on buildings, essentially. So, I don't want to pretend like I have all the answers, but if you've listened to my last episode, you'll know that I am kind of going all in and really investing my time into urban rewilding. And so this is an area that I've become convinced is a really strong leverage for building climate resilience, recovering biodiversity, and improving the lifestyles and the health and well-being of urban residents in kind of one inspiring topic, and that's urban rewilding. I found a new nonprofit recently called Urban Wilding Hub, and the idea behind this is that rewilding projects or rewilding philosophy within cities is quite a new thing. It's really just starting to grow, but it's happening in isolated pockets. And what I want to do is to create a hub, the Urban Wilding Hub, which is a kind of an online home. It's a central meeting point for people who are involved or who want to be involved or interested in bringing more wild to cities in big and small ways. If you haven't listened to my previous episode, you can scroll back and have a listen to that, or go straight to the website, which is urbanwildinghub.com. The link to that is in the episode description, and you'll find ways to get involved, to support the mission of really making this a mainstream approach to managing urban nature in cities, which I think will have lots and lots of benefits. Okay, that is it for me today. This episode I originally wrote as a newsletter article on my Substack. I posted that, and I was kind of quite surprised that it got a lot of positive feedback from people saying that it gave them a lot of clarity. And so I thought, this would make a good podcast episode. So very happy to have recorded this for you, and I hope you enjoyed it. You can always jump over to the Green Urbanist newsletter on Substack and subscribe to that, where you can get more articles like this and some updates here and there about the different work that I'm doing. Cool. Thanks for listening. See you next time.